When childhoods and children's lives in sub-Saharan Africa are discussed in Western media and popular discourses, and even in academic discourses, the emphasis is placed on how different they are to those that can be identified in Western Europe and North America. This dissonance has been used to explain and justify the inapplicability and lack of implementation of child-related international laws, policies and programs in much of the African continent. Certainly, there are indeed childhoods and children's lived experiences in sub-Saharan Africa which are in stark contrast to what is seen as the ideal in Western European contexts. But it is also possible to identify similarities or commonalities between notions of a proper childhood as understood in the West with those found in the region. Therefore, to focus on the dissonance or the differences that exist between African childhoods and those that are seen to be the ideal in Western Europe and North America does not tell the whole story of African childhoods. Instead, there's a diversity in childhood constructions and children's experiences of growing up within the region, within individual countries in the region, and within communities in each country. This diversity can be attributed to a number of factors. However, situating these diversities that can be identified today within a historical context is important because they are not new. Diversities have always existed in African contexts, and these became especially more evident as a result of a particular historical event which affected much of the continent, specifically colonial rule and its accompanying missionary engagement. Most countries in sub-Saharan Africa were colonized from the late 19th century until the middle of the 20th century by a small number of European governments: Britain, France, Belgium, Portugal, and Germany. This period initiated a process which not only shaped the economy of subjugated territories, but also had an impact on the cultural and social spheres in which Africans lived their everyday lives. This included the sphere of the family, where new values introduced into society about proper marriage, proper family forms and practices, proper personhood, proper childhood were experienced and actualized. This historical context, which provided a backdrop for many children growing up, needs to be understood in order for us to really get an insight into the diversities that can be found within this region. To explore the impact of colonial rule and missionary activity on understandings of childhoods and experiences of children, I decided to travel to Ghana, a country which was formerly known as the Gold Coast and which was colonized by Great Britain from the late 19th century until 1957. While in Ghana, I interviewed 18 individuals who had attended school before the end of the colonial period in 1957. 6 of these agreed to be filmed for this documentary. This film seeks to share their stories about growing up under British colonial rule in the Gold Coast and the way it shaped their worldview, not only as children, but later on as adults, who also in turn sought to transmit these experiences to their own children. Many of the people with whom I spoke had little direct contact with the colonial government as children. However, there were a small number who had experienced direct contact with the colonial government, and this was mainly as a result of the background of their family or the occupations that one of their parents held.
My mother was a school teacher, a trained school teacher who stopped teaching after marriage. Married at 17 years old, stopped teaching right after that. My father was a lawyer. Back to my mother, who was born of parents who were, one was a Methodist minister, and my grandmother was a regular housewife. You know.
My father was a pharmacist. Those days they were called dispensers. He was a chief pharmacist. And those days when your parent, especially your father, owns a car, then you were quite an elite, in the society.
My father used to be a clerk in the colonial government when we were in Kibi, where I was born. And then his uncle died, Then he moved to this village or land that the family owned. So he became the farm manager there, and I moved there with him, and my sisters were also born there. So this is a purely farming community, and particularly they farmed cocoa.
And with such parentage, you know, as I said earlier on, you sort of, there was no question about not going to school.
So my father was a lawyer and a politician. He was actually a member of the Gold Coast Legislative Council as well. So, and of course that meant that he had colleagues and friends who were of that order, who were always around the house, you know. So there was a lot of very senior Ghanaians around as we were growing up.
I didn't know what it meant to learn or to study, because being a product of educated parents, we were speaking English at home. We were visitors who came to the house would speak with you in English and so on. And so I was quite fluent with English as compared to my other mates. My parents were more of the imperial type of citizens who were made to feel they were second-class Europeans. Even our attire, mostly dresses, not, it was only at harvest time that you had kente on with a handkerchief stuck in your bracelet to bluff. But otherwise, it was strictly European type of upbringing.
For the majority of the people who participated in the film, the most direct influence of colonial rule in their lives was felt through their interaction with initiatives established by missionaries, even if they were no longer present or at the forefront of activities when they were growing up. Two of these initiatives are especially notable: Christianity and the introduction of school-based education. Missionaries, whose arrival in the Gold Coast preceded the advent of formal colonial rule, introduced new ideas about family, personhood, child-rearing, and all of these had an impact on the lives of increasing numbers of children. This legacy continues to be evident across the Gold Coast today. Much of this evidence can be seen through the visibility of churches, the increasing numbers of people who attend church on Sundays as well as other days, and the celebration of religious festivals that take over a whole village or town on certain occasions.
My parents and my grandparents were good Christians and a Presbyterian. At first, when you say I'm a Presbyterian trained, then that means you are well trained, manners, everything.
My paternal grandmother was known as a very strong player in the Basel Church, the kind of woman in those days who led a women's group, led a choir, sang alto or bass or whatever had to be done, a leader.
My mother's side, in terms of being a Methodist, dates back to Reverend Gediel Akwa. He's a strong Methodist. It's about 4 generations from me. And he actually translated the Bible into Fanti for use in Ghana.
We were brought up as Anglicans. As I said earlier, my father was the choir master organist, and so all of us were actively involved in the church activities.
So we were brought up the Methodist tradition, and we grew up in that. So the values that we had, Christian values.
In my father's and mother's house, they were, I can say, pagans. But the time I left to my auntie's house. They were Christians. They baptized me. So they take care of me as she take care of her own children.
We went to church every Sunday. We had a Sunday school, and we were, as soon as the church started, Sunday school was separate, and we had a lot of teaching in the Sunday school, singing, and also reading the Bible and Bible stories and all that.
This building, as you see it, started as a Sunday school for the indigenous people in this area. It was named after Reverend Thomas Bate Freeman, a British who arrived here in the Gold Coast, the then Gold Coast, in 1835. He started the Methodist setup in this area, and he established what we now have, the Accra Diocese. So with this establishment, this building, as you see it, is the first Methodist church that started here in Accra, Ghana.
So I also attended the Ridge Church School, and many of the teachers at the time I started the school were from England. But as time went on, more and more Ghanaian teachers came into the school, and eventually it became fully Ghanaian.
They were educated, and those days mostly missionary schools. So by the time you finish school, you were a Christian by all means, because religious studies were taught. Those days, I think they call it scripture. Scriptures were taught in school, and you were confirmed, you were baptized and confirmed in whichever denomination the school belonged to.
When the first missionaries came, they had some difficulties with the people, because the people don't know much about them, so interacting with them became something difficult for them. But as time goes on, those who are educated got to start talking to their people to accept them as people who are bringing the word of God to them. Although we know we have gods, yet they are working with the Supreme Being. With the setting up of the Methodist institution here in this place, it has changed the lives of so many people in this area.
Part of missionary endeavours sought to achieve a moral conversion within groups whom they considered to be primitive and backward. Therefore, education was seen as critical to civilizing and converting the local population. Due to the success some missionary groups had had within working class communities in Britain through the Sunday school movement, many realised that the most effective strategy to civilize and convert indigenous populations was to influence the minds of the younger generation. As a result, schools were established, which initially had as their primary purpose the indoctrination of Christian values into children, who will then take these forward into their community. By the time my participants were born, schooling had become widely desired amongst the African population, as it was seen as enabling them to acquire the knowledge of white people, which would help them to compete in the new literate economy that was gaining ground quickly within their contexts.
I started school when I was 10 years at Presbyterian Primary School at Asisawa. I started with my elder sister. We were the only people or first people to start the work in my family.
I went to school when I was little, I think 4, because we don't go 2, 3. And Before they take you into that class, you have to put your hand across your head, and when your finger touch your ear, then you are ready to go to Abajokbo. That is the kindergarten. But if your finger could not touch, then you have to go home. It's something that you see other children leaving the house going to school, so you'll be so amazed to dress in school uniform and go to school.
What they taught me at school enlightened me more, and it gave me the entrance to be on my own. So it helped me very much. So in school, it will broaden your mind.
Many of these schools that were established at this time focused much of their teaching on a curriculum which was disconnected from the local context.
We were taught in English. We were not supposed to speak any local languages. And it was the same in secondary school.
It was in the secondary school that I first had a teacher who wasn't white, a black Ghanaian. In Wesley Girls, from Form 1 right up to 6th form, we had about half of the teachers being expatriates.
Certainly by the time you go to middle school, it was all English. And you learned your Ga or Twi and so on as a language in its own right, but the means of communication was English all the way through.
Geography, for instance, was very different from what people did abroad. I found this later on, but whilst we knew everything about the Commonwealth, for example, I remember very well that you'll be given a picture of sheep shearing, and you have to write about this, and you have to know that this is from Australia, and this is wool for making clothes and all that.
I remember the poems, the sort of poems we learned, talking about snow and so on, Niagara Falls, the Blondin, blah, blah, blah. Well, all English, even though we did not know what snow was like. And the various seasons, the 4 seasons of the year, we don't strictly have that here.
One subject is hygiene. It was a subject that was taught, and we used to joke about this, that the person who brought hygiene was actually killed by hygiene. But we liked it because it taught you how to do things at home, at school, wash hands, all those things were done, and the reasons why you were doing all of that. It was a subject. It had its own syllabuses, what you expected to know, and people did that. And it was an easy subject because you were told very practical things, mosquitoes, drainage that have to be cleaned and all that. You are actually seeing these things. It's not like some textbook report or anything. So hygiene was important. It was done at every stage until you finish middle school.
The type of education we had was lopsided. You became more British than Ghanaian, if not more British than the British.
Boarding schools, in particular, were seen as especially effective in detaching the individual from what was considered the negative influences of their family, especially elderly members of their family, such as grandparents, who were seen to be more resistant to the changes that missionaries, with the support of the colonial government, sought to achieve. In some instances, rather brutal or harsh strategies were adopted to keep children away from the influence of their families within these boarding schools.
So I remember there was a cholera outbreak, And I was rather disappointed with them because we were told not to accept any food coming from our parents. Our parents would visit us once in a while and they would bring home-cooked food, which was always, well, home-cooked food is preferable to the food you get in school. And perhaps they cooked us nicely, you know, special dishes. And then during that time, they said, no, you are not allowed to eat anything from your homes. And the nuns would come and seize the food and throw the food away or give it to the dogs, to their dogs, right in front of us. And I thought that was very mean. And they told us that we should eat what the tinned food that we had brought to school, like the sardines and the corned beef or the gari and the shito, was better than the food that came from home. So I wasn't happy about that.
However, not all boarding schools sought to simply separate children from their community. A good example is Achimota School. This school was established by Sir Frederick Gordon Guggisberg, who was governor of the Gold Coast between 1919 and 1927. The school was established as part of a reform plan to ensure that there were higher levels of education available to indigenous people within the Gold Coast. In this school, there was indeed a strong British culture and the teaching of British subjects was prioritised. But there was also a recognition of the importance of the local community, and there was emphasis placed on ensuring that children remain linked to their roots.
My secondary school was in Achimota School. That was in 1952. And what was striking about the school, as I recall it, was the very strong presence of teachers from England. Teachers who were mainly products of, or teachers from, the English public school system. And therefore, to a very large extent, the culture which they transmitted was the English public school culture. Now, of course, these are strong points, but also weaknesses. First, the weaknesses. The primary weakness was the danger of educating us away from our roots. That's a danger, unavoidably. But in fairness to the school authorities, they literally worked hard to balance that out. I had to learn the Ghana dances in Achimota. So despite the public school diction and so on, they were compensating efforts to balance it out. So in the end, my generation came out of the school not only educated to the highest level possible, but not too far from our roots.
These schools, whether day or boarding, further sought to teach children to be loyal to the British Empire and to the King or the Queen. They also sought to ensure that children felt part of a community that consisted of different countries which belonged to the British Empire. This was done through the establishment of an annual event to celebrate the birthday of Queen Victoria on May 24th. On this day, all school children would be expected to dress up and participate in a march past at their local park in front of colonial officials and some local chiefs.
I don't recall exactly being taught anything about the empire at the beginning, but it must have been completely pervasive of everything that we did. For instance, Empire Day was a big day, as I'm sure you will have heard from others. And so we're very conscious of the empire, even at that age.
Those days we are under British rule, and when it's Queen or the King's, I celebrated the King's George's birthday.
The children were taught to march and so on, but it wasn't much. Once a year, and The strong ones were the ones who were made to march. And we sometimes went to watch, but I don't think I really understood what was going on.
When you are in kindergarten, you don't march. So you be crying. When am I going to grow old so that I will wear the beret, the school uniform, and march? When you get to class 1, there you start marching.
At that early stage, we did not examine what empire was. We simply took for granted. There was a governor, there was a whatever, commissioners and so on. So that was almost normal. We were in the empire and believed in it as kids. As we went along in the school chain, the issue then became what you learned about the empire. Importantly as well, you learned nothing to the contrary. This is what I'm getting at. So you're absorbing the empire culture, empire thinking with no counterbalancing until later, when the independence movement began and so on and so on. But until then, you were taking on board whatever there was. And this is important to point out, because even in the later years, when we were more able to think more clearly about things, the things you learned still kept reinforcing the empire background all the time, all the way to the very end. So even when you had a doubt about the empire and its doings, you still read the history of the empire and knew more about London and London Bridge than anywhere else. A very effective indoctrination was done, and nothing crude, nothing direct, but constant.
So how did these factors shape African lives both then and now? According to those I spoke to, it affected their worldview, the values that they prioritized, and their overall orientation.
What did we learn about Britain? Nobody explicitly said that Britain is the colonial masters. It wasn't like the French, our French-speaking neighbors, who I later on learned, who were taught in school, our ancestors, the Gauls. We were not taught our ancestors, the British, no. But the orientation was definitely, and even by the time I was in school, we had stopped learning British history.
We were sort of brought up, if I may use that expression, a proper way, you know, how to behave, how to speak, and that sort of thing. And anything outside what they prescribed was thought to be ungodly.
Cream crackers, Jacob's cream crackers. Is it Jacob's? Yeah, cream crackers. All those custard creams. So the orientation, the food, well, the comfort foods, Yorkshire pudding. You know, these were items that we learned how to, scones. These were items that we learned how to bake. So this was definitely British. So the British influence was very subtle. At that time, on Fridays, we had singing hour, and they taught us lots of British songs. What? You lose your girl in the ocean. You know that song? I've been to Harlem, I've been to Dover, I've traveled this wide world all over. Anyway, songs like that they taught us that had nothing to do with Ghana. Even the literature you are reading, we did Wordsworth, I Wandered Lonely as a Cloud. We learned about the Lake District in Ghana. You know, we had never set foot there, but we knew about it. So definitely it was my orientation was very British.
So you had an upbringing where you were supposed to be God-fearing in your behavior, in your speech, even in your thoughts. You should behave as God would want you to behave. That sort of mentality, you kept to yourself and not mix with people who were not Christians.
Education definitely brought, asking questions about yourself and your society, and being a little bit more critical, so that I was able to tell my father, and perhaps also I had a father who was very liberal. He wasn't authoritarian at all. And so I told him at some point, I don't like this business of church. People go to church and they're so terrible when they come back home and this, that. And he says, and so I'm not going to attend church anymore. I don't like it. And he says, all right. And I said, I'm not using my English name anymore. From now on, I'll use Mansa.
When I look at some of my cousins and others who did not benefit from this kind of education, and they have become problematic for the whole family. Every now and then you have people who, so to speak, they have not developed any good IQ, and their behaviors have not been very well, all because they were not properly educated.
The fact that these individuals' main interaction with colonialism was through attending school and their families' engagement with Christianity influenced their overall assessment of colonial rule when reflecting on the issue. In particular, most of my participants in the study, whether they were filmed for the interview or not, were active Christians who sought to ensure that the values underpinning Christianity influenced their everyday lives as well as those around them. In addition, all participants spoke positively about the colonial education system, which was seen in a much more favourable light, especially when compared with the Ghanaian education system today.
I think it's almost unavoidable that a colonial childhood would have an effect on the child, no matter how you look at it. It can be one of acceptance or rebellion or whatever, but there's no way in which you could live through the times we live through without being affected by the colonial system in some way.
The colonial system, I think, was very good. It helped the teaching of or bringing up of children, because whatever the teachers thought was good, the parents will also support.
Christian schools are the best. People goes to Christian school, their behavior is different.
In my case, the education I went through was very colonial. It was quintessentially colonial. And therefore, I'm in a sense very much a product of that system. And at that level, the effect of the system is not so much to make you do this or that, but to condition your mind and your thinking and your values and the things you know about, as to make you amenable to playing along the colonial line. So both the colonial system as a whole and the religious dimension of it together conditioned the majority to colonial objectives. So until you begin to recognize that those are not your objectives, you go along with it. When you do recognize that they are not your objectives, as I have done forever, for a long time, you then reject it. But it doesn't change you. You are still what you are. It means that you don't deploy the colonial tools against the colonial system. I'm proudly Achimotan, but I'm also proudly anti-colonial. And my life has been exactly on that trajectory. Professionally, I have always been clearly anti-colonial. Not wildly marching around and screaming my head off, but all my work. From my research, through my teaching, through the things I've done, have been regularly anti-colonial, without denying the strengths which I derive from that history.
The legacy of British colonial rule and missionary engagement remain evident in Ghana today. This is despite the fact that the country has been independent since 1957, when Kwame Nkrumah came to power determined to advance Pan-African ideals and ideas surrounding African unity. In relation to the way childhood is understood and how children are raised, the legacy of colonialism remains especially visible today. This was noted by a number of participants in the film.
It's complicated because right now, as I am now, I still have that love for Britain or things British. At the same time, there is a conflict there because I think that I shouldn't have that British orientation. So on the one hand, I know I shouldn't be thinking that way, and I know I reject it. But sometimes it creeps in. The colonial experience has created complicated individuals, complicated and sometimes confused individuals. And we need to reorient ourselves by bringing up our children and even infusing more of our own values into our entire educational system and our lives in the society, for us to value what we are.
The focus away from community and groups to individuals and the advancement. These are all part of a new colony we're talking about. And therefore, all of that creates an atmosphere in which you are bringing up our children. In the same way that we said earlier, that we in my generation absorbed from our parents, well, I did, from my parents and the school, almost subconsciously, the values which I reflected afterwards. In the same way, today's youth are absorbing these values unconsciously.
We give children the values that they should live by. And so everybody is caught in it, even for the child. You may not be necessarily aware of what is going on, but you imbibe all the values, and later on you have to sort things out yourself. So I don't think we are doing the children, we're giving them a very healthy legacy, because we haven't really, the adults and the middle class, we are so, sometimes I get so angry about, we are the ruling class and we are so politically bankrupt. We haven't really reflected on and sorted out the colonial legacy very well. And so we continue to waffle around with Western ideas, and the Western ideas are important, but they are not the only ideas in the world. But we behave as though they are the only ideas, and that our own ideas, that's what religion did to us, that our own value systems were rubbish, and that the Western value systems were the superior ones. And we are not questioning all that enough, and it sickens down to the children.
This film does not seek to suggest that these stories presented here are representative of all those who are part of this generation in Ghana. Certainly, while during the latter stages of the colonial period in the Gold Coast, the number of children attending school and the number of practicing Christians increased substantially, there were still significant numbers who were not part of this new value system. In fact, there was a lady I spoke to who told me that because she had never been able to go to school, she had not been affected at all by colonialism when she was growing up. As a result, alongside this Christianized and schooled child that came to exist in the Gold Coast by the end of the colonial period, there remained evidence of the child who was not associated with school, or whose family was still guided by paganism or not quite committed to Christianity. This diversity continues to exist in the way childhood is understood and constructed in Ghana today. Taking both childhoods into consideration is critical to changing narratives about childhoods in contemporary sub-Saharan Africa. It will also help with battling unhelpful stereotypes and recognizing that synergies that exist between childhoods in what is now Ghana and, let's say, the UK are due to a shared history which continues to shape children's lives in this context.